Alleluia.
The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark.
Glory to you.
As Jesus was passing through a field of grain on the Sabbath, his disciples began to make a path while picking the heads of grain. At this, the Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?" He said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he was in need and he and his companions were hungry? How he went into the house of God when Abiathar was high priest and ate the bread of offering that only the priests would lawfully eat, and shared it with his companions. Then he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. That is why the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
So continuing our trip through the letter to the Hebrews, we've talked about the centrality of the priesthood of Christ in this letter. Perhaps the letter was written by St. Paul sometime between 60 and 100 AD, and it's really more of a sermon than it is a letter. It doesn't have a greeting and a conclusion like most of St. Paul's letters have, but rather it's sort of a homily or a sermon on the priesthood of Christ. And so today we hear about this mysterious figure Melchizedek, whose name also comes up in the first Eucharistic prayer, also known as the Roman Canon. And he comes from, that is, his name comes up first, in chapter 14 of the book of Genesis, when Abraham is returning from a battle, and he encounters this priest or king, Melchizedek. It's called the King of Righteousness, or the King of Salem, the city of Salem, which means peace, so King of Peace. And as he meets Melchizedek, Abraham, he, recognizing that he's a priest, Abraham offers him what was due to the priests at the time, 10%, a tithe of what he had gained in the battle. And Melchizedek, in turn, offered a sacrifice of bread and wine for Abraham in thanksgiving, and blessed Abraham. So this offering of bread and wine was foreseen by the early Christians, or was seen by the early Christians as a foreshadowing or a prefiguration of Christ's priesthood and the offering of his body and blood, which would become, or bread and wine would become his body and blood in the sacrament of the Eucharist. Melchizedek also comes up in one of the Psalms, I forgot which number it is, and then here again in the letter to the Hebrews with regard to the priesthood. So the reason that the name comes up in the canon, the first Eucharistic prayer, along with the sacrifice of Abel and sacrifice of Abraham, is that all these figures were seen as prefigurations or foreshadowing of Christ. So Abel, you recall, Cain and Abel, the sons of Adam and Eve, one offered sacrifice to God, they both offered sacrifice to God. God was pleased with Abel's sacrifice and not with Cain's. We don't know why, the text doesn't tell us. But in any case, the offering that Abel gave to God was a foreshadowing of the offering that Christ would make of himself to the Father. Abraham's sacrifice, you recall, was to offer his son Isaac, his only son Isaac, as a sacrifice on the altar. And then you remember that God stopped him, or the angel stopped him from going ahead with the sacrifice, but he was willing to make that sacrifice, foreshadowing the Father's sacrifice of his Son for us, made present on the altar for us today. And finally, the offering of your high priest Melchizedek. And so Melchizedek, once again, being a foreshadowing or a prefiguration of the bread and wine which become the body and blood of Christ, offered to the Father as a sacrifice for sins. So that's kind of the short story. There's much more complicated background about Melchizedek and who actually he was, but for our purposes, the important thing is to recognize the Old Testament prophecy, if you will, or foreshadowing of Christ's sacrifice of himself as a priest.